Okay, I think we've got everybody joining. So again, good morning and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for what I expect will be an interesting discussion during this year's Climate Week, looking at procurement policy and how it can accelerate climate action from a Buy Clean perspective. I'm Jay Moreau, I'm CEO of Lafarge Holcim's Aggregates and Construction Materials Business Organization here in the United States. Today we'll hear from a talented panel of experts representing different organizations, including nonprofits, state government, academia, and private corporations. Will be moderated by Victoria Mills. She's the managing director for the Environmental Defense Fund. And thank you, Victoria, for your leadership on this topic.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, great to have you with us. And we all recognize that there are challenges ahead. We are expected or projected to have 10 billion people on the planet by mid-century. During that same time period, we'll need to construct more than 2 trillion square feet of building space. That means in New York City every month for the next 30 to 40 years, to put that in perspective. And there's no doubt that cement and concrete will play a key role in building the foundations that support this continued urbanization around the world. In the United States, the call to lower the carbon footprint of concrete presents us with exciting opportunities for transformation. From products, technology, partnerships, supporting legislation that all help us to move markets. I'm proud to say that Lafarge Holcim is not only transforming the way we operate, but we're also creating new building products and solutions to help build both people and planet. I often say to our people here at Lafarge Holcim that we expect them to take ground every day. And when I think about this last summer, I was glued to the Olympic Games. It's all about competition, right? And I think about how those athletes took ground every day, but that's not what we saw. We didn't see the early mornings that they went to practice, the late nights, the hours they put in. What we saw was the result of those efforts. And it's that effort of taking ground every day that leads to exceptional results. So I think about where we are today in accelerating the impact we can have together on climate change. We need to take ground today to lead to those future results. And that's how I like to relate to it for our team. And I'm very proud about the leadership our team has taken. But just like for our elite athletes, we need to increase the focus on performance and move away from prescriptive specifications. Focus on the results rather than the inputs. There weren't any Olympic medals awarded for practices. They were only awarded for the performance. They were rewarded for the people that really excelled and made a difference. With the increase in collaboration, we can achieve better performance and we can achieve more sustainability. We're already seeing traction in places like Massachusetts, New York, Colorado, Texas, and those who influence building materials can specify these projects and accelerate demand. Now, as demand grows and demand accelerates, and it's important that we are transparent about what goes into the manufacturing process. EPDs play a key role in developing this transparency. We have to be honest about what goes in our products and what impact those products have to make a real difference. One of the most important factors is also in legislation that aims to build market-based economy that incentivizes and rewards companies that innovate and build cleaner. It's an important part of our record. It's an important part of our path forward. And that's exactly what we're starting to see in Washington. We see it about some of our state capitals. Governments across the country are choosing to use the power of procurement to not only to push for, but it incentivize those that take part in the change, that want to move the industry and take part in moving markets. I'm very proud to represent a company that's fundamentally committed to sustainability. And it's exciting to see all the innovation that's taken place across our footprint, across the entire world. I'll leave you with this and turn it back to Victoria to lead the discussion. Decisions have consequences. Procurement decisions have consequences. Together, we can make informed decisions that can move markets and accelerate climate action. That's what we're going to talk about today as it relates to Buy Clean. With that, Victoria, let me turn it over to you to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Jay, for that terrific setup. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel on Buy Clean, using the power of the purse to accelerate climate action. I'm Victoria Mills. I'm on the EDF Plus business team at Environmental Defense Fund, And my work focuses on partnering with businesses to advance public policies that help them achieve their climate and energy goals. I'm so excited about this topic because it's such a critical piece of addressing the climate crisis, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment. So today we're going to learn about three things. Number one, why decarbonizing the building sector is so important. Two, what kinds of low carbon solutions are available and what it will take to bring them to scale. And three, how public policy, specifically by clean procurement policies, can accelerate progress. So I'm thrilled to welcome our four panelists that are experts on this topic. The Honorable Tracy Burnett, State Representative from Colorado, Jason Walsh, Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance, Stacy Smedley, Executive Director of Building Transparency, and Jeremy Gregory, Executive Director of the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium, and from my hometown in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So panel, let's start out with some very brief self-introductions. Please share with the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do. And let's start with you, Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy Burnett, Colorado State Representative. I call myself a mom, an engineer, an entrepreneur, and also I'm a world-class runner. And I have an engineering degree from Cornell University and a Harvard MBA. I've worked in construction, energy, aerospace defense, and also in the computer industry. Last year, I was elected to the Colorado State House. And I passed 10 bills in my name, 8 of which were environmental, and 3 of them were groundbreaking. One of them was a gas energy efficiency bill that, for the first time in Colorado statute, introduced the social cost of methane. Another bill is a clean heat bill, first in the nation, that requires all utilities in Colorado to reduce building greenhouse gas emissions by 22% by 2030. But today I am going to talk about my Buy Clean Colorado bill. So thank you.
We look forward to that. Thank you, Tracy. Let's go to you, Jason Walsh.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks to Jay and Lafarge Holcim for hosting this great panel. So I'm the executive director of the Blue-Green Alliance. We are a national partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations, 7 national labor union partners, 6 national environmental organization partners. Collectively, they represent roughly 15 million members and supporters in this country. Our founding and still guiding principle is that we should not have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment in this country. We can and must have both. To make that principle real in the industrial sector, it means simultaneously supporting domestic manufacturers, supporting U.S. jobs, and driving down emissions in an increasingly carbon-constrained global economy. So the topic of this panel kind of hits squarely on a key mission of the Blue-Green Alliance, and that's why I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you, Jason. Let's go to you next, Stacy Smedley.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having me this morning. My name is Stacy Smedley. I'm currently the Executive Director of Building Transparency, which is a nonprofit that's got a mission to actually reduce embodied carbon emissions through free open access data and tools. My background is on architecture and then in construction and procurement, always focused on reducing environmental impacts of those fields. I'm also a mom and a singer, so I'll just take Tracy's lead there and do a couple personal bits.
That's great. Well, maybe you can do some singing with Tracy on her harpsichord that you see in the background. Now, Jeremy, why don't you round us out with the introductions?
Sure. Hi, I'm the Executive Director of MIT's Climate and Sustainability Consortium, which is a group of companies partnering with MIT, trying to vastly accelerate implementation of large-scale real-world solutions across different sectors to help meet global climate and sustainability challenges. And this is a new kind of academia industry partnership where we've intentionally have companies from many different sectors like Accenture, Apple, Boeing, Dow, Cargill, Lafarge Holcim's one as well, and along with PepsiCo and many other companies, IBM, Verizon. And the whole point of having these companies from different sectors is to try to really leverage the fact that it takes entire value chains to really achieve deep decarbonization targets. So before this, I just started a few months ago. Before that, I was the executive director of the Concrete Sustainability Hub at MIT. And in that role, I spent a lot of time working with cement and concrete companies about how to achieve different decarbonization targets using different strategies. And in that, spent a lot of time talking with folks, including several on the call today, about how we might best implement buy clean policies. And so I'm glad to talk about some of that work here.
Thanks, Jeremy, and all panelists. We clearly have a stellar lineup here to address this topic. So here's how we're going to use the time today. So we're going to start off with opening remarks, about 5 minutes for each panelist to share their perspectives on Buy Clean and on this topic. Then I'll moderate a discussion with the panelists and with Jay, and we'll dig deeper into some of the ideas that come up in their opening remarks. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function to enter your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And then finally, I'll turn it over to Jay to wrap us up. So that's how we plan to use our agenda today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tracy, for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you. I have to say, my favorite memory of the sausage making process of getting the bill through is I was on the House floor addressing all my colleagues at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, and I was talking about concrete. And I thought, oh my gosh, who the heck cares about concrete? And so I said, well, here's the reason you care. The processes used to create and manufacture concrete and steel represent 14% of the total worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And if cement, which is the glue in concrete, were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. This is why you care about this subject. So this whole concept of greenhouse gas emissions associated with construction materials is called embodied carbon. And my Buy Clean Colorado bill is the most comprehensive bill of its kind that's been enacted in the United States. It addresses not only buildings, but also transportations. But where it's groundbreaking is that it includes concrete, cement, and asphalt, as well as steel, glass, and wood. So what this bill does is it directs the state architect and the Department of Transportation to develop policies that use greener construction materials in state-funded buildings and transportation projects. And it also tells them to strive to achieve continuous greenhouse gas emissions reductions over time. And it does this using the international standards, the Environmental Product Declarations, or EPDs. I tell my colleagues, these are like nutrition labels for greenhouse gas emissions. The lower the EPD, the lower the greenhouse gas emissions, or what some of us refer to as the global warming potential of these materials. You know, it's an emerging concept. Ideally, you'd want to look at the greenhouse gas emissions over the product life cycle, but most EPDs, to my understanding these days, just include the first part, from extraction of the raw material through the manufacturing process. So there's many different ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in construction materials. You can use different manufacturing processes, and some even sequester carbon, for instance. You can use different raw materials, including recycled materials. You can use green energy, such as renewables and hydrogen, to power those industrial processes. And I've learned that there's thousands of EPDs that have already been published by many manufacturers. And there's also tools that architects and contractors use to evaluate and specify their green materials in their projects. So in this whole sausage making process that I went through to get this bill passed, there are many supporters and stakeholders. Some of the supporters, well, first of all, many architects understand embodied carbon already. So the American Institute of Architects was on board from the beginning. Some manufacturers like Lafarge Holcim, they manufacture green cement. And so that they were very supportive. I'd have to give a huge shout out to three groups, though: the Carbon Leadership Forum, the Blue Green Alliance, and also Building Transparency with their EC3 tool. They were instrumental in educating me and advising me, and also educating and advising all the stakeholders. They actually did demonstrations of their tool. So this was really important. Environmental organizations, including recycling organizations, were very supportive, as well as the Colorado Energy Office in the Department of Transportation, because they are tasked with meeting greenhouse gas reduction goals throughout Colorado. Other stakeholders were general contractors overseeing projects and on-site contractors like the Ready Mix Concrete Association, the Asphalt Pavement Association, and of course, labor, as well as some other materials manufacturers. So what, people ask, well, what are the key takeaways? What are the main benefits of this? Well, I told my colleagues, by using the Colorado state's significant purchasing power, we're talking about $54 billion in buildings alone over the last 10 years. This can foster private industry to reduce the embodied carbon in the private projects as well. And, for Colorado is home to some of the greenest cement and steel manufacturers in the US. Of course, Lafarge Holcim, as well as Everett Steel. And so this is good for the Colorado economy. It fosters circular industries for recycled products. You can recycle steel, asphalt, and tires. Tires are used, recycled tires are used in the Lafarge Holcim's process. It's good for public health, it reduces air pollution. And it also creates jobs. This is really important. Jobs in both rural and urban areas in Colorado. Colorado is home to 3 cement plants and 69 asphalt companies in 42 counties. And then finally, it's just good for the climate. Colorado has very specific greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, and this helps get us there. So thank you.
Very powerful story, Tracy. Thank you so much for sharing that, and lots we can dig into in our discussion. Since you mentioned labor, I'm going to go next to Jason Walsh. Jason, can you talk about what angle do you bring to this from the BGA perspective, how you got involved, and what are the benefits of Buy Clean for labor?
Yeah, happy to. Let me start though by giving just a little bit more context to some of the excellent context that Representative Burnett provided. I think it's important to recognize, kind of in a global context, right, that not only are individual materials such an enormous source of greenhouse gas emissions, but the industrial sector as a whole is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions globally, right? We also, I think, need to recognize that manufacturing, which is the single biggest part of the industrial sector, is enormously important as a linchpin of the US economy and as a source of middle-class jobs. One of the most significant barriers to reducing manufacturing emissions, though, is the lack of market pull for low carbon products, right? In the absence of a carbon price or a similar mechanism, we need to create markets that will support a transition to cleaner, lower carbon materials. This lack of market pull, combined with the really complete absence of a coherent US industrial policy, has contributed to the perverse position we find ourselves in as a country, in which we import roughly as many CO2 emissions embodied in products manufactured in foreign countries for US consumption as the total emissions from the industrial sector in the United States, over 1,400 gigatons annually. So to put it bluntly, we have simply exported a large portion of our industrial sector emissions over the last several decades, with really disastrous consequences for manufacturing workers, their communities, and the climate, given that many manufacturers relocated their production to countries whose environmental standards are as low as their labor standards. This carbon leakage status quo led to the creation of Buy Clean, a policy framework that was developed by BGA and our partners, the crux of which, as Tracy just explained, is to use government procurement as a means to create demand for the use of lower carbon construction materials in publicly funded infrastructure projects, which also directly contributes to strengthening US manufacturers and the jobs they provide, which gets at the labor angle that you asked about, Victoria. The development of Buy Clean emerged from, frankly, too many instances across the country of domestic manufacturers with cleaner, often unionized facilities participating in the government bidding process for infrastructure projects, but losing out to competitors based in countries with little to no environmental, public health, or worker protections who could underbid for projects without accounting for the climate costs, in addition to a few other costs of production. So in collaboration with a broad coalition and excellent legislators, BGA developed and passed the country's first Buy Clean legislation in California in 2017. As a result of that law, contractors bidding for infrastructure projects paid for by state taxpayers will have to begin to show that certain infrastructure materials do not exceed new emission standards that are scheduled to be released in California in January of next year. The good work started in California spurred BGA and our partners to lead similar efforts in other states, including Oregon, Washington State, Minnesota, of course, most recently in Colorado, where it was a pleasure to partner with Representative Burnett, and where the Buy Clean Colorado Act was signed into law not so long ago. Over the last year, we've also worked to design and win Buy Clean policy at the federal level to take advantage of the federal government's purchasing power, which is exponentially greater than that of individual states. As part of that effort, the Blue-Green Alliance has brought together a broad coalition of labor unions, environmental groups, center-right organizations, industry, manufacturing associations, individual companies around a federal Buy Clean policy framework. We've been thankful to the insight and opinions of Lafarge-Holcim throughout this process. We are looking to advance Buy Clean with both legislative action via bipartisan legislation in both chambers and executive action, hopefully via an executive order that BGA has proposed to the Biden administration. Both the legislation and the executive order are drawn from lessons learned in California and place a priority on ensuring the transparency and disclosure of data to address the knowledge gaps around embodied emissions of the products that Buy Clean covers. So toward that goal, we're very pleased, and we work toward this outcome, to see language included in the markup of the Build Back Better Act in the House, which provides $250 million for financial and technical assistance to manufacturers to develop EPDs for their respective materials and products. We believe this supports, this is absolutely key for supporting data and transparency, and is really central to a comprehensive and effective Buy Clean policy. Our coalition is also pushing for complementary supply side policies that are also at play in Build Back Better legislation to support the big capital expenditures necessary to retool and retrofit existing manufacturing facilities and build new facilities to meet the demand for low carbon materials. So we need to have both the demand side and the supply side. And we are pushing for policies to ensure that all of this is done under the strongest labor, environmental, and safety standards, and that we directly address environmental justice concerns around co-pollutants and disproportionate impact. There's more to say, but let me stop there. I think I'm at time.
Thank you so much, Jason. That is really an impressive array of accomplishments by your organization. And thanks for giving us a preview kind of what's happening at the federal policy level too, which we can get more into in the discussion. So I've heard a lot about environmental product declarations and the need for transparency. Stacey, I think that's where your organization comes in. So let's go to you next.
Sure, and I'm going to start a little bit prior to building transparency, because really what EC3 and EPD used in procurement came from for me was through the private sector, actually. So there is a lot going on in the private sector that supports and complements and needs to align with what we do with Buy Clean policy on the public side. In my previous role at Skanska, we were working for large owners that were setting zero carbon targets, companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and others. And those zero carbon targets included their supply chain. And really all these emissions we're talking about when it comes to embodied carbon emissions of construction materials are supply chain emissions for owners, architects, engineers. They're things that we are buying and procuring and specifying. So that led us down the path at Skanska to try to find a way to look at carbon emissions of materials like we look at cost, which led us to environmental product declarations where we could get to that carbon intensity per unit of material, just like we have a cost per unit of material. And that's really what led to the co-creation of the EC3 tool, which is a tool that takes all of these environmental product declarations that exist from suppliers that are third-party verified and disclosed, that typically live in PDF documents, and digitize them into a database where initially the private sector could access those EPDs, find the carbon intensity of products, and start to use that to specify low carbon options and procure based on carbon and cost. So Building Transparency was established as a nonprofit to take this tool that was built with a mission of being free and open access and incubated at the Carbon Leadership Forum to really ensure that industry and the public sector was also engaged, and create a home for it where it could continue to be free to use, but also scale, include all the EPDs that would be created hopefully over time into a database where they could be used. So the good news is that we've been using this data now for a couple of years in the private sector and to support the policies like the one in California and now the one in Colorado as they pop up, to both be able to set requirements during specification for lower carbon options through performance specifications, which I think Jeremy might talk about in a minute, to really incentivize competition to create lower carbon options at time of bid. So the good news is where we're doing that, where we actually have the EPDs in place, a database to source them, and then knowledge from the private sector owners like Microsoft here in Washington, where we have EPDs for our 3 large concrete suppliers. We've gone through that process. So we've kind of mocked up by clean policy in the private sector procurement world. We've put language in the documents to actually require EPDs. We've said to the concrete suppliers that we're going to have carbon and cost in our bid decision process. That's led to at least a 30% reduction in the emissions of our concrete products for projects with no cost increase. So we've proven, I think, where this data exists and where these kind of policies can be tested in the private sector, that they work. Just to put that in perspective, if we were able to reduce concrete and steel emissions across the US for all our consumption of those projects in 1 year, just by 20%, that's the equivalent of reducing 44 million tons of carbon, or taking 10 million cars off the road, or 5 million homes energy use, or 11 coal-fired power plants. That's just a 20% reduction that we know that we can accomplish as long as we have the data and we have the procurement requirements in place. So there's a huge, I think, kind of low-hanging fruit component of this, where once we have this data, if we have policies like the program that might incentivize and pay for the actual EPD production for the suppliers, there's a huge potential for both the private and the public sector to use that data as it's readily available to reduce these emissions pretty drastically, pretty quickly. So I think my main points are, we know the data that we need. We know how to get that data into a place where it can be accessible. We know the language we need to include in some of these specs and bid documents to actually incentivize the reductions. And we know the kind of reductions we can now achieve. So really, it's just about implementing this policy, whether it's at the state or federal level, and really getting to work.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Why don't we go to you next, Jeremy?
Great. Thank you very much. I think what I want to talk about is, we heard from Jason and Representative Burnett about the challenges of getting these bills implemented, which obviously are passed, which are huge. But then when you do that, someone has to figure out how to actually make them happen. And as someone who loves kind of data and analyses, we spend a lot of time thinking about that. And there's a few different lessons that at least I want to share from our discussions and thoughts about how you incorporate embodied carbon into what we call vendor selection for procurement. As Representative Burnett said, you could pass policies that are about building design or pavement design, but right now we're talking about procurement decisions and vendor selection as opposed to design selection. So I think there's 4 main elements to keep in mind. One is how do you do comparisons of the environmental impact of products? And EPDs are one way to do it. And as we've talked about, they kind of have their positives and negatives when it comes to comparisons. But also Stacy and the folks at EC3 are developing calculators that can be used. And so there's many different considerations associated with that. And it definitely can be done. It's just one thing to make sure that environmental impacts are compared in a consistent way. The second thing is, how do you compare performance? There are many, many different types of concrete, and they do many different jobs, right? The concrete you use in a sidewalk is quite different than the concrete you use in columns that are supporting a skyscraper. And so having effective ways to be able to do that is important. And Jay alluded to earlier, performance-based specifications as being one thing that I think is a key part of that. So that's the second thing. The third thing is what we call vendor selection. How do you deal with, normally vendor selection occurs when you say, here's the product that I need, which entity is the lowest cost? Well, what do you do now if you have someone who has lowest cost but highest environmental impact, or vice versa? We have lowest environmental impact but highest cost. And so there are different ways to be able to think about that as well. And I think the last thing is incentives. Jason mentioned this a little bit, that it's great to have bills that have some incentives in place to allow companies to start to ramp up to measure their environmental performance. But I think another big thing we need is incentives for the purchase of low carbon materials. Many low carbon materials don't have a high premium, but if we really want to do deep decarbonization, we are going to need some incentives for paying for those really low carbon materials. And we have a lot of precedents for this. We've certainly done this in the renewable energy marketplace, where we have incentives for solar energy and wind energy and things like that. I think we also need to step up and say, if we're going to really achieve deep decarbonization within the building material sector, we need the same thing. So those are just some of my thoughts in the space.
That's great. And I think this gives us a lot to have a very productive discussion about. I will want to remind the audience, if you want to ask a question, please enter it using the Q&A function. I'll start it with some questions of my own. I mean, having heard all of this, it sounds like we have the ingredients to make this recipe, to take low carbon building materials to scale. We have the low carbon solutions exist. We have the data about, or we know how to get it, about how to create the transparency to enable people to make preferential purchasing decisions. Policies are starting to take shape, at least at the state level. We have a few examples in California and Colorado, and the promise of some elements of policy that could be at the federal level. Where do you all see, if you think about this as a journey and an arc, where are we in the beginning? Like, how in a process, where is the bar and moving across the screen? And what are some of the most powerful elements that we have to push on in the next 2 to 5 years to take low carbon building materials to scale?
I'll take a stab at.
Sorry.
You want to go ahead? You want to go ahead?
We're all
Jeremy?
eager.
Sure. I'll just say one thing really quickly is that I spent a lot of time studying electronics recycling systems. And there was a time about 10 to 15 years ago, when there were several states that were experimenting with legislation about how you fund electronics recycling systems. And for a while, it just ramped up. Year after year, there were more states passing legislation, and then it stopped. It stopped at about halfway, 25-ish or so states that have it, and then still to this day, half or so that don't. And part of that was because industry tried to get together to come up with their own solution, and they really couldn't agree. And that couldn't be implemented at the national level. And so I think I see us kind of on the cusp of that as well. Will we have sort of more national guidance, or is this going to be sort of a patchwork of different state solutions, which may not be bad, but I think there could be a similar thing where a bunch of states pass and then it just stops. And so I think that kind of tension between the state and the federal is interesting.
Thanks. Who else wants to get in?
Well, let me just echo what Jeremy said and add a little bit. We absolutely need federal policy, right? It can't just, state by state is really, really important, and we will continue to do that work. But we need a federal framework, and the two can be complementary. Mm-hmm. To your initial question, Victoria, I would just say that yes, I think know how to calculate the data and get it. but not all companies in this country are like Lafarge Holcim, right? I mean, you know, there are a lot of companies out there that don't issue good, credible EPDs, right? Which is why it is so important that we put the resources out there, particularly for small and medium-sized manufacturers, to actually be able to do this. And then it's, you know, as with other parts of life, you can't just trust, you got to trust and verify. Right. I mean, we do need third party accountability here, verification. We need to make sure that we know that the data is actually credible, right? So those are key pieces, and we can talk more about what I only alluded to at the end of my opening remarks, which is got to make sure there are resources in place for US based manufacturers to actually make the CapEx, right, investments to make this stuff, because it ain't cheap.
Yeah.
I think I just want to jump in on your initial question too, on the trajectory of where we are, because I don't think anyone's answered that one yet. And I think
Thank you.
I typically tend to be a positive side of this, because we've made a lot of progress. I think we have to take credit and account for the fact that, you know, 5 years ago when I was on panels around embodied carbon, no one knew what it was. So we're at a point now where we're having these types of conversations in just a handful of years, I would say, and that's something I really think to take account for. The second thing, I think on the data and the rigor, I think your point about we know what we need to do. I think we all on this call know what we need to do when it comes from that data and the requirements that we can put into policy to ensure that we're asking for data that is at least apples to apples, not apples to pineapples, which is, I think, where we need to go. So really, again, if we're having state policy, federal policy, private policy, which I think is also policy when it comes from these large owners that are setting these requirements, if we can align what those policies are asking for, it's okay if there's some at the state level, a federal policy, and then Microsoft asking for this data, as long as it's the same rules, the same rigor, the same data. And I think we know how to do that. It's just making sure all those pieces are talking to each other and putting out those same asks or those same requirements as we build these policies.
Yeah, consistency is key. Tracy, you've been very patient.
No, that's fine. I absolutely agree with everything that Jeremy and Jason and Stacy have said so far, but I want to add a couple points. What I've seen is a lot of times states can act a little faster than the federal government. And if there's enough, by passing state policy, it can really build up momentum for the federal policy. I've already had one state representative reach out to me and asking, geez, can I copy your legislation? And this is the way state legislatures work. We look at what's done in other states, we copy it. And so this is why I'm so excited about getting it done in Colorado. This will spur other states to do this, and hopefully the federal government. But the really hard part that it also had in passing this bill was transportation. This is, I mean, architects get this. It's a relatively new concept for transportation, the transportation industry. And I kept telling the stakeholders during this time, we are building the airplane as it's taking off. I get that. I understand that. A lot of it is just simply education and getting familiar with this. So that's why in my bill, I actually had two paths. One, a quicker path for buildings, because the state architect and the architects get this. And I am giving the Department of Transportation more time, but I love what they're doing. They are doing pilot projects. They're requiring bidders next year who win contracts to submit EPDs. These contractors have not submitted EPDs before, some of them. And that by the time this policy comes out, all bidders are going to have to submit EPDs. But one of the things I thought was really fun too was this was really hard on some organizations like the Asphalt Pavement Association. But what I found was a couple of weeks after I got this bill passed and signed by the governor, there was this little newsletter from the Asphalt Pavement Association. And they said, gosh, this bill is just passed in Colorado. Here's this free tool we have. It takes you 15 minutes to develop an EPD. That is a kind of conversation and education we have to do.
Well, that's a great story. And it sounds like there's so many great lessons learned from your experience in Colorado. So that goes to the first audience question here. Representative Burnett, would you be willing to answer questions from legislators in other states? Can they contact you if they want to introduce similar legislation?
I would love that. I would love that. And yes, already one legislator has contacted me, and we'll be setting up a meeting soon. So this is the way we work at the state legislature. So yes, absolutely.
That's great. Well, I want to make sure I give Jay a chance to weigh in, as Lafarge Holcim has been in this business for a long time, on kind of how you see that transition, where we are in the transition, and why you felt it was important to weigh in on the Colorado legislation. So
Well, it's very important to us because climate action is a core value for our organization, right? And so if you think about running a concrete business or a cement business, what we internally look at it is we earn our right to operate on a daily basis. And so if we're not thinking about where we are on that curve and where we want to go, then we're not staying true to what is a core value to our organization. And whether it comes down to developing Portland limestone cements that, reduce the clinker factor, to trash and tires that we can burn to use alternative energy, all those are things that, as Jason says, cost money to implement, but we're very dedicated to doing it. But we need a level playing field too, to where the environmental impact is weighed as heavily or is valued at the same level as cost. And so at the end of the day, moving markets is hard, but alignment between public and private sectors accelerates that. I think we're very early in the phase. I think we can accelerate very quickly. And it takes organizations like ours to partner and align with the folks that are represented here today to accelerate the action and reward those that take the leadership roles.
Thank you, Jay. The next question is for you, Stacy. And there's a question from someone in an academic institution who's asking, are you sharing your tool in a robust way in the higher ed sector? And that they have sustainability networks of 60 national higher ed associations and would love to share out this tool and bid criteria language to help it become the norm in the higher ed sector.
No, that's great. And yeah, we have had engagement with a variety of universities where we've worked with professors to create coursework around the use of the tool. It is a free tool, so you can actually have a whole class register for the tool for free and use it to actually do kind of case study and piloting of some of this and assessment of materials. We also have free resources on the website already. So we've worked with a network of over 20 private owners to develop an embodied carbon action plan that's on the website. And then that links to a whole bunch of language, including bid language, including an EPD request letter, including kind of basis of design contract language for owners. That's all published and available for free at buildingtransparency.org. But I would love to talk further about how to maybe get into that network and create some standard coursework and lessons and documents to even further what we're doing. So happy to connect further on that.
That's great. So we have another question for you, Representative Barnett. This relates more to the challenges in getting your Buy Clean bill adopted. Did you encounter any sort of not in my backyard position among Colorado residents who may not be as interested in greener products, but are exposed to sort of local extraction and location of facilities? Were there any other was there any other organized opposition to the bill that you had to address, engage with, compromise with, and how did you go about that?
Thank you for the question. Actually, there has not been opposition in terms of not in my backyard. I think because the facilities are already located in places that give good jobs. But I'd have to say, Colorado in general, a lot of the legislation we passed this year has to do with disproportionately impacted communities and making sure that we are doing things that are not hurting those communities further, and also cleaning up those communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution. So no, nothing to date. So yeah, I think, again, the biggest issue I would say was transportation and getting used, people getting used to it, as well as I think we are going to have a continuing conversation about how we can tighten up labor things, the things that Jason talked about in terms of, how good are those EPDs, these international EPDs? How do we account for transportation of these products, to the product site?
Thank you. So I have a question for Jeremy now. Especially for us lay people who may not understand the details or the specifics of what low carbon building materials look like. Can you talk more about what are some of the solutions that are available? What kinds of materials should people who want to specify low carbon building materials be looking for? And a related question or complementary question, what role does building design play in enabling the reduction of embodied carbon?
Sure. Yeah, those are both great topics. Why don't I start with the materials one first? And there's a couple different ways to think about it. One is basically what's the impact of the raw materials you're using to make your building products, right? So if we use concrete as an example, you have basically four main ingredients, right? Water, sand, gravel, and then some type of binder or cementitious material. And so what a lot of companies are doing are basically using a mixture of different types of binders, some that have a higher impact than others, and some that are actually waste materials from other processes like fly ash from coal-fired power plants or slag from steel production. So that's a great way to lower the environmental impact. There's also some more ambitious strategies that actually use carbon dioxide captured from industrial sources, whether that be power plants or cement production. And you can inject that into the concrete to help with curing, or you can also use it as a way to make other constituent products like aggregates. And so there's a lot of opportunities to take captured carbon and actually lock it into concrete by a chemical transformation. So those are kind of two different levels. And going back to what I was mentioning about incentivization, some of them, the more conventional ways, won't have a high cost, but if we're going to really shift to those kind of the ones that are using more of that captured carbon, we probably will need more cost incentives associated with them. Now, getting to your question about design, there's just huge opportunities when it comes to the way we design our buildings and our pavements and other infrastructure to reduce carbon. It's a bit more complicated because you're taking a life cycle perspective. And it could be, for example, that using what we consider to be, quote, a higher carbon material, if that then enables, for example, building energy reduction or less vehicle fuel consumption, those could be, that could be the best solution. But having said that, we really should be doing both, right? We should be trying to lower the embodied carbon of our materials and also taking that life cycle perspective on design. And that's what's neat about a Buy Clean initiative, can still be consistent with taking that overall design approach to lower environmental impacts.
So is there kind of an analog to the reduce, reuse, recycle formulation of start with source reduction in terms of minimizing the building's overall footprint and then specify low carbon building material, or do you see it differently?
No, I think it should start with a holistic design thinking, really, that you are trying to say, how do I lower the overall environmental impacts? Then what are the materials that I need in order to achieve this performance? So if I want a building that's going to last a long time, that's going to be resilient to natural disasters, you have to take those into consideration. Then when you make those decisions, how do I get the lowest carbon version of those? I think one of the neat things about concrete, and as I mentioned, the use of those, what we call supplementary cementitious materials like the fly ash or the slag, you can still get long durability. You can get high performing concrete while having a lower footprint as well. But sometimes there are different trade-offs, maybe when it comes to construction time, it can maybe affect that. We have to sometimes do things a little bit differently than what we've done before, which probably Representative Burnett knows that civil engineers are a risk-averse bunch. And I appreciate that as someone who drives over bridges and spends time in buildings. But of course, if we're gonna do something about climate change, we're gonna have to try something different. So it's gonna have to be that we find these materials that can achieve that performance, but also give us the lower embodied carbon as well.
Thank you for that. Stacy, I want you to, maybe you can explain the formulation that you just put in the chat of how you realized
Yeah,
carbon reductions.
That's how we talk about it, I think, when we're trying to talk about these different avenues and ways to reduce carbon emissions of buildings. So it really starts with material optimization, and that gets into, can you reuse an existing building and not have to procure those or use those new materials at all? And can I then reduce the number of materials I'm using or the amounts that I'm using? And what are the best options between, material A and B? So that's all the optimization stuff, that kind of whole life carbon life cycle perspective. And then once you've done that optimization, can I procure the lowest carbon options for the materials that I am going to use? If you do both of those things and track that all the way through procurement, then you're actually realizing your carbon reductions. So I love Jeremy's point though. It's what's nice about Buy Clean is it's taking this one component of it, and it's complementary if we then look at the whole kind of whole life approach too. So it's not a versus, it's an and I think that's really important to remember.
Thanks. Jason, do you have anything you want to weigh in on this in terms of the nuts and bolts of?
Well, I want to actually,
this?
Jeremy talked a little bit about risk, and I want to come at risk from a slightly different perspective, which is and really speak to the role of government here, right? One of them, there's some things that government does badly, but one of the things that government does well, particularly in the energy sector, is to de-risk the commercialization of new technologies, right? So let's take the example of utility scale solar. There was a time not very long ago, about 10 years ago, when the private sector wouldn't touch it because it was so new, and it had not been done at a commercial, in that case, utility scale, right? So the Department of Energy, through their loan program office, basically financed the first cohort of utility scale solar projects in the country. And some mistakes were made, and a lot of more successes were achieved, but the end result of it was that it demonstrated to the private sector that you could actually do this stuff at scale. And so what has happened subsequently from that point is that the private sector has primarily taken over the financing of utility scale solar. The point I want to make here is that we need to do something analogous in support for the manufacturing of first of a kind technologies, right? That will enable industrial decarbonization. Almost all of the most cutting edge industrial decarbonization technologies are being commercialized in other countries. And it's not because the manufacturers there are more innovative or entrepreneurial. It's in fact, often the opposite is true. It's not because their workers are more skilled. It's because they have the right policy supports in place as national and sometimes regional governments to actually support the deployment of these things, right? Which often include sovereign state investments in that deployment. So that is all to say that we're in a moment now where, in addition to procurement, which is absolutely key, we have the potential to invest as a country in first of a kind deployment of a lot of exciting technologies in cement concrete, in iron and steel, in glass, and in this array of energy intensive manufacturing subsectors, which really drives most emissions in the industrial sector. And I think we absolutely have to take advantage of this opportunity to make that happen.
So can you talk, and I'll put this question on the whole panel, what are, it's climate week. It's also Climate Week in the US Congress, or the next couple of weeks. In terms of, there's some really important climate related provisions that are being debated. There are some that are in the bipartisan infrastructure package, and there are others that are more in the budget reconciliation bill, which is basically the Build Back Better agenda. Can you talk about, from this buy clean perspective, or from a reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment, what are some of the policies you are most excited about? And what guidance would you give to our audience in terms of where they should be making their voices heard and advocating right now?
So to start with your last question first, this is the time, right? Hopefully most people on this call are not complete masochists and are not tracking day to day what's happening in the U.S. Congress, right? but we're kind of at the cusp here of either moving forward with ambitious climate forward budget reconciliation legislation, or having it all fall apart, right? So to the extent that the folks who are listening in here care about a suite of climate policies and investments that will have implications for this country meeting its climate goals over the next 10 years, over the next 30 years, now's the time to engage with your policymakers, your members of Congress. I think there's some really exciting things happening in provisions moving forward in Congress. So the House has gone first in marking up their suite of Build Back Better bills. We're big fans of 48C, right, which is the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit, which has been funded at $25 billion by the House Ways and Means Committee. But even there, we're going to have to make some fixes. There's not enough money that is dedicated in that tax credit, at least on the House side, to the kind of industrial decarbonization strategies that we're mostly talking about here. It's more focused on component parts manufacturing for renewables and other clean energy technologies. Incredibly important, but what we're missing is dedicated funds, whether it's in the form of tax credits or in the forms of other kinds of financial federal assistance, which is grants, loans, and loan guarantees. Many, if not most of them, are authorized and run through the Department of Energy. We're still a little short on that front, and I think that's where we need to do the most work. We've been collaborating with our partners to kind of push the ball forward on that, including EDF, right, which has been playing a real leadership role on this. And now's the time to do it.
Thank you. I could not agree more on now is the time. And EDF recently joined an open letter from 12 environmental groups to businesses saying, we really need you now. And there are important climate provisions in the budget, right? Reconciliation legislation, and we need your support for those and to help get that bill across the finish line. Perspectives from others on this?
Yeah, I have not read the federal legislation, I must say, but there are a couple of thoughts I have. One of them is, I'm just going to throw it out there. We need a carbon fee and investment nationwide strategy, because that's the overarching market-based goal that's going to drive all this other legislation. We can do piecemeal things, but that's one thing I just have to put a plug in for. The other thing is that I think, if you look at how much asphalt and concrete and steel is used in transportation, this is where we're really going to make a huge difference going forward in terms of just the amount of carbon we can reduce. And so we need federal action in this area. Specifically, there's a lot of discussions we've had at the state level about preferences, and it's just a whole new area for many many transportation professionals. So get federal guidance in that area and really pushing forward on that would be my recommendations.
I just want to say, I think we've already talked about this one, but for us, obviously, with the work that we're doing with EC3 and kind of transparency, just the funding and the requirements for the transparency through EPDs. I think the point that the government can help fund that. Once those EPDs are created, they're not just used for the federal government. They're out there in the world, and they can be used by anyone. So I think that's the part we're most excited about, because I think that's really tangible and likely to make it. Fingers crossed. But advocating for transparency and disclosure, and then rigor around the ways that we disclose.
Jeremy, you have a perspective?
Yeah. What I was going to say, I think what's neat is that I've really seen industry get involved the past several years on how we do this measurement of environmental impact and do comparisons. And the tide is really turning on the degree to which they view procurement as something that they can benefit from rather than something to fight. And I think the other good thing is that, it was fascinating talking with Jason's staff about how the California bill got passed. And a lot of them said, it got passed much quicker than we expected, and maybe frankly, more than we had time to kind of think through. And and that's why, frankly, it took several years to implement, because in California, they had to figure out how they were going to do all that. So we have many more years of much more industry involvement and how this can be done. And that's great, because then I think by the time it actually comes implemented, it's a good sort of a government and industry partnership. So I think that's heartening to see.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jay, I would love to let you get in on this as well. And what provisions are you liking that you're seeing in some of the federal legislative proposals?
Well, from our perspective, the panelists here cover really, when you have measurement, you have performance, you have transparency, any legislation that supports that, then industry can respond to that, and industry can invest based on that. So, as we look at the legislation that supports development of innovation, we've got lots of good ideas, right? We have ideas where we can take carbon from our stacks and inject it and embody it in a recycled concrete. Well, we haven't proven it yet. We're working on it, but and those are the sorts of things that need to be supported. That's just a small action, but when you rack them up and look at the opportunities to innovate versus what you can invest in without support and legislation that reward you for diving into those things and taking those risks, we're not going to see it accelerate the way we want it to.
So thank you all for your answers on that. We have two very nuts and bolts questions that relate to kind of how to take action on the policy opportunities. So one is, what can a contractor do, a concrete contractor do to support the Buy Clean initiative? And the second is there sort of a one-stop shop where people can go, and perhaps we could circulate this to attendees afterwards, but where they can kind of understand what the specifics are, what they can advocate for?
I just want to let Jay take the concrete question, but I'll jump in on my thoughts on that. I think and understand your mixes and optimize for carbon, whether or not you're being asked to. I think I always use the analogy of the cake bakers, where concrete suppliers are baking these cakes out of this concrete mixes out of these ingredients, and they know that they can replace some of that flour to lower the carbs, right? So I think that there's just understanding and thinking through mix design with carbon in mind, but then also investing in disclosure and getting ahead of the requirement through the EPD process. And I think there's resources out there, us and maybe even reaching out to the Wholesums of the world to understand how to do that if you're a smaller supplier. So just start educating yourself now and thinking about things through the lens of carbon reduction.
I'll jump in with a couple things. I think just reaching out to the Carbon Leadership Forum and building transparency and just getting informed. There's just a wealth of information there. Also, Rocky Mountain Institute has a lot of information, so you can really get informed from a advocacy standpoint on these things. I actually have a fact sheet that I used. I'd be happy to push that out to to this audience. That what are the things that, from a public policy standpoint, why do we care about these things? And I just have to put a plug in. There's another way to do this, and that's the investment community is catching on to this. And so this is something they're looking at embodying carbon, but also they're looking at the risk in certain industries of the impact of climate change on that industry, on those companies. And so there's another way that we can really push forward on this.
I think that's a really important point. And I think sometimes all the talk about ESG and really consuming interest in ESG metrics can miss the larger point that unless you can reduce climate risk systems wide, any one company's reduction in climate risk really doesn't have that much impact. Jason, what advice do you have?
Yeah.
You
So,
want to advocate?
yeah, I love that question. So first of all, in order to give you the best advice, it'd be good to know where you're based. Because policy is, as Representative Burnett knows better than anyone on this panel, is made by individual policymakers who represent particular districts, right? Particular parts of the country. So that would be good to know. We do have a Buy Clean website that tries to collect a bunch of examples from different states, including now in Colorado, of these policies. I will put it in the chat, hopefully before the end of this panel. I don't remember it off the top of my head, I'm afraid. And that's also a really good resource. And you can also just go to the Blue Green Alliance website and find my email address, and we'll figure out how you can make an impact, because contractors, I think, are some of our most important advocates for this stuff.
Any other comments from you, Jay, on this question of how people can make a difference in helping to get Buy Clean policies adopted at either the state or federal level?
Yeah, I think there were good responses here from the panel, and we're, as Lafarge Holcim is more than happy to have a conversation with anyone that wants to, be part of that conversation and talk about innovation and how we can drive those decisions. And reference was made to the investment community, and if we're going to move markets, the investment community has to be somewhere near the top of that list for that discussion, and down to not only the investor that's building a high-rise building, but down to the individual that's buying a home, right? If they demand lower carbon footprint in the structure, then we're going to be in a position to be able to supply it as an industry. So I think those discussions are incredibly important.
Great, thank you. So there's a question about where does a national price on carbon stand in your priority? So, EDF has long been a proponent of economy-wide prices and limits on carbon emissions. We are also very strong supporters of the climate measures and provisions that are in both the bipartisan infrastructure bill as well as the budget reconciliation package. I think these two things are complementary, and would very much agree with Representative Burnett that a price on carbon can sort of exert a downward gravitational pull on entire markets and help make these other policies more powerful, more impactful, more quickly, so that we are getting the most cost-effective greenhouse gas reductions first. So that's the EDF answer. I would love to hear from others on this.
I'd just like to
It
say
can help raise money to pay for
I look at
the investments.
Yeah, I look at the tool, the things like Buy Clean Colorado and all these other initiatives that we're doing at the state level, federal level. These are the tools we use, but we need that overall arching goal of reducing carbon. And to me, that's through carbon pricing, and to me specifically, it's carbon fee and investment. So just got to put a plug in there.
That's from others.
And nothing else to add. Yeah, it will definitely help. No question.
Great. Let's take the question in a different direction here. This is getting a little bit more technical. So material optimization is a great way to start the decarbonization journey, but the challenge is how many parties prescribe what concrete is. So how do we move from this prescriptive approach of sort of defining these are the materials you have to use to an outcome-oriented approach? And this involves, really great transparency on what is the embodied carbon of different material choices, as well as policy design that is more about the outcomes, as you were saying, Jay, than about the specific ingredients that are chosen. So I'd love to open up the discussion for perspectives on that. Who wants to go first?
I'll take a crack at that. For maybe folks who aren't familiar, generally the concrete that's used on a project is developed through a prescription or a specification, excuse me. And in that specification, it basically, depending on how you do it, sometimes it's a prescriptive specification that basically says your concrete has to have these kinds of ingredients in these amounts, or at least within some ranges. And the reason that's prescriptive, it's kind of like a recipe saying this is exactly how much flour you use, how much sugar, et cetera, like that. And that can be good for the people making the concrete because they say, well, the concrete, I followed the recipe that you used, right? The downside is that a lot of those prescriptions actually limit opportunities to lower the carbon of the concrete, and oftentimes unnecessarily so. There's many instances where people have asked, why is this prescriptive specification written like this? And a lot of people don't know. They just say it's always been like that. So Jay alluded to this early on. It's much better if we can shift to more performance-based specifications, where rather than saying, here's how the concrete has to be made, you instead say, this is the performance I'm looking for. This is the durability. This is the strength. This is the stiffness. And then allow people to innovate then on how you achieve that with while also trying to lower the carbon of that. But going back to the risk aversion I mentioned, this is doing something different. And a lot of times it takes people would rather not try something different. But what I've found is that if you present this as something, usually engineers are writing prescriptions and they should be writing that in partnership with ready mix producers. But generally, in particular, like when it comes to building construction, there's no incentive for them to work together. So what I often say is if you have a goal of creating a low carbon, using low carbon materials, you need to start early on with a conversation using the example of buildings with the architect, engineer, contractor, and the ready mix supplier. And one of the first things you should do is look at those specifications and say, do we really need them like this? Do they allow us to innovate to use low carbon materials? And so I think that is, kind of going back to what the question is, you have to have that as a goal early on and get the whole team there to really say, to kind of go through the whole process now, but not only looking at performance, but also at low carbon.
I want to put a check mark by Jeremy's comment, because that's exactly, when we were first starting to look at this before, I even really knew what EPDs were at Skanska. The first thing that we did, we had an owner that said they were looking at carbon reductions. We went to the concrete suppliers and said, if we want to reduce the carbon in your concrete mixes, what do you need from us and what should we do? And they said, please provide us with performance-based specs. Tell us that you want the lowest carbon mix that meets these performance requirements. Put that in your specs so that we can actually deliver this for you. And that happened before the building was even designed. And that's what led to these reductions that I was talking about in some of our projects where we've done that process. So we've proven that out and piloted that. And that is exactly what needs to happen for this to be successful.
Yep. Yeah. We outcome metrics for us are at the center of Buy Clean because we want to measure the result we want, right? We care much less about how contractors, manufacturers actually get there. There are a bunch of different pathways to get there. We want to get to the goal, and that's what we should measure. I think for the purposes of a policy discussion, it's also just important to note that measuring these kind of things for public procurement then also, and Stacey's mentioned this and others have mentioned it, also is what you need to measure for private sector purchasing, right? Mm-hmm. And so if the next generation of policy making around this is something like a clean product standard, right, which is essentially figuring out this set of incentives in the private sector, if that is focused on an emissions metric, which is the outcome that we want, it fits very well within that kind of a private sector structure as well.
Tracy? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I just have to agree with everybody. As a legislator, I do not want to be prescriptive about how we do things. I think it's really important to set the goal and the direction and the incentives. So that's all I have to say about it.
Jay, your thoughts on this?
But two things: prescription limits innovation, right? So it takes the tools away, and we change in the industry slowly. That's the nature of the beast, right? And so we have to recognize that, and we can accelerate that change. And don't discount the fact that technology has changed such that we can deliver a better product. I mean, we can embed sensors in the concrete that gives you exactly where it is in the maturity cycle. We have equipment on our trucks now that tell you exactly how much air is in there, how much admixtures, how much water is in there. I mean, we can deliver a product that's completely different than what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so we have to recognize those things, and specifications and acceptance can change to recognize that. And it will continue to, it'll accelerate on the digital side, that will get even better and better as time passes.
Thank you. So I might just take this as a last question as we're getting close to our time here. And then I'll do a final go around to the panelists to see if you have any closing remarks, anything that you didn't say that you want to get in, just maybe a minute each, and then turn it over to Jay. So this is a question I don't know the answer to myself, but someone, the audience member is asking, we've talking a lot about carbon. What about methane? Does methane play a role in building construction, energy source? Methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas pollutant. Is there any aspect of methane pollution reduction that figures into Buy Clean or other important greenhouse gases that we haven't talked about yet? Tracy.
I would love to take this question. Methane is natural gas, and methane is a form of carbon, and I couldn't agree more. It is an exceptionally powerful greenhouse gas, and if if we can really focus on reducing methane quickly, that is really going to get us a long way. But in terms of embodied carbon, you can use, instead of using gas to power those industrial processes, and instead of using electricity generated by a local utility that uses that generates using gas, you can use renewable electricity, but also hydrogen, green, and I have to say green hydrogen. Hydrogen that's produced using renewables can be used as a supplement in gas-powered facilities. Hydrogen can also be used as it's emerging technology, but it can be used as storage for renewable energy. So I just had to throw that in there. I couldn't agree more with you that we really have to focus in on methane.
Thanks, Tracy. Anybody else? All right, let's go to closing comments. And Jeremy, you're in the northwest corner of my little Hollywood Squares arrangement here, so I'm going to let you go first.
The more I study sustainability, the more I think it's primarily about behavior change. And I think what surprises, people think of behavior change when it comes to recycling or getting people to make individual decisions. The issue of behavior change here is getting the people in the architecture, engineering, and construction communities to change. And it's to change the way that they think about design, cost, and environmental impact optimization. They're used to just kind of optimizing on that cost versus performance. And now we're adding in this other thing. And a lot of times people start talking about it, and it's always easier to just say, let's just do what we've always done. And what we need are, what the social scientists call nudges, right? We need more nudges to get people to say, hey, think about this now, and we're going to support you when you make that change. And Buy Clean is a perfect example of a nudge that we can use to, as other people said, incentivize innovation. So I think we have to probably stop thinking about it as a technical challenge. As I mentioned, we have all kinds of technological solutions to lower carbon. We also need to think about it as like a behavior change thing, but very focused on these people who are making decisions about which materials are used in projects. And if we can do that and create the right nudges and support them when they do that, that's how we're going to create success.
Thanks, Jeremy. We'll go to you next, Tracy. Closing comment.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you about this subject. It's obviously something I'm very passionate about, but it doesn't stop here. In my bill, I'm requiring that the state architect and the Department of Transportation report back to the legislature on the lessons they've learned and more importantly, the obstacles that they've encountered. So this, to me, a big challenge is the education, just educating the contractors and communities and about embodied carbon and how to do it. I also think that we need some work, especially with EPDs and making sure that these are that all EPDs meet the same consistent standard. There's a lot of discussion going forward about narrowing down how we treat wood products, and I'm already talking to my colleagues about how we can ideas on how we can foster the private industry, incentivize the private industry to do the same. So I just again want to thank all of you for this opportunity to talk about this very important subject, and it doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning.
Thanks, Tracy. Stacy, you next.
I just want to, I think, kind of build on what Tracy said earlier, actually, about just the resources that are out there. I think there's enough of us now that have some expertise or knowledge about this, and we're all willing to share. I think it's a unique case where policy is happening at various levels all at the same time. Everyone's talking about this at about the same level of adoption and kind of implementation right now. So use the resources that are out there. Hopefully some will be shared with this group in terms of links to organizations like the Carbon Leadership Forum, Blue Green Alliance, all of us on the phone. MIT's group is also very knowledgeable on concrete. Just start educating yourselves and talking to all of us and everyone else out there that wants to really provide expertise and feedback and make sure that we're aligning how we're approaching all of this. We're all here and I think willing.
Thanks, Stacy. Jason.
I think I'll close by just going big picture and doubling down on something I said earlier. And the fact that we're in the middle of Climate Week, right? That's why we're doing this panel. And to state the obvious, but it bears stating as often as possible, particularly this week, we're in the middle of a climate emergency, right? Every red light out there is flashing over and over again. And we are in a moment that's actually pretty rare. Hasn't come around in my career, and I'm pretty old, right? Where we have the ability to move legislation that meaningfully puts us on track to hit our climate targets as a country, which is absolutely essential given the leadership position of the US in the world, something that President Biden was talking about to the General Assembly this morning, puts us on track to show to the world that we're serious about this as one of the biggest carbon emitters out there, right? So to those of you listening, if you're not already engaged with your elected representatives or your members of Congress, please do this. There's, I think, been a little too much attention to the cost of this legislation, not as much to the outcomes. And one of the outcomes we want is a livable planet, as well as a fair and more equitable society. And we've got a chance with this reconciliation legislation to be on a path to achieving both of those. So I'll close with that.
I could not agree with you more, and I could not have said it more eloquently myself. And I think you hit on really the central, the nub of it, which is the cost of inaction on climate is far too great to let this opportunity pass. So with that, I want to thank Lafarge Holcim for hosting this panel, and Jay for your participation. I want to thank all of the panelists for their perspectives and their expertise and their commitment to advancing this cause. I want to thank everybody in the audience who was able to join today. I'm delighted to be part of the conversation. I've learned a tremendous amount and have enjoyed this discussion. So with that, thanks everybody. And I'll turn it over to you, Jay, to close us out.
Thank you, Victoria, and I echo your appreciation for all the participants and the panelists here. And thank you for your leadership in walking us through the discussion today. It's exciting to me to see the alignment that quickly develops when we sit together and have a discussion, right? And so, if we're going to get there and we're going to advance climate action, it's discussions like today where, you have what I'll call a virtual cup of coffee with people. Maybe when the pandemic's passed, we can come together and have a cup of coffee together. But that's how we learn, and that's how we develop alignment. That's how we, by appreciating views that, represented possibly differently here today, but we're aligned on the direction we want to take things and what needs to be accomplished to accelerate climate action. So thank you all for your participation. Very enjoyable discussion today. And now we can go out and take action and move the needle and move markets together. Thank you, everyone.